Hello, welcome. I'm Bill Easterly, the co-director with Yao and Yarko of the Development Research Institute, which is sponsoring this event. Our distinguished guest, Lant Pritchett, is part of our program for visiting scholars this semester that we have at DRI. Later this semester, we're having Ann Case, who is here, and Ross Levine later in the semester. So I was brought in as the expert to address the problem that most introductions are too long. So I'm going to try to solve that problem here. I want you to hear Lant, not me. So Lant is great. I've known him for 34 years. I've learned a lot from him. You will learn a lot from him. Welcome, Lant Pritchett.
There you go.
Way to go.
Well, I'm very grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I've been thinking about this topic, and this has given me a chance to sort of assemble sort of things I have been saying and writing and evidence I've been producing over the last 10 or 15 years about this topic, kind of integrated in a way. It's a little nerve-wracking being here in front of Angus Deaton. He was a discussant on a paper of mine, at the conclusion of which he said, Lant Pritchett's so fun to listen to, sometimes you could forget he's completely full of shit. So I hope both of those will continue to be true. So maybe he uses that a fair bit, huh? I was thinking, and I'm not quite sort of the age and technical sophistication of opening with Queen's "We Are the Champions" to sort of set the tone of triumphalism. The debate is over. I won. They lost. On all of the key empirical claims one would have needed to maintain in order for RCTs to be perceived as an important contribution to development practice and improving human well-being, the evidence is just overwhelmingly that they're just not true. So I'm going to sort of walk you through. I hope to just get there. I hope to keep this relatively short because I think many of the people who are here in the room today have opinions and have been thinking and working on RCTs, so I hope to leave some substantial time for discussion. But I do want to sort of lay out the basic framework. The basic framework was, there's not, that much super debate that RCTs are better at doing the one thing RCTs do better. If you want the before and after impact of having carried out a specific action, doing treatment and control to try and identify the impact effect is much better than most other before and after, or diffs and diffs, or other methods to achieve causal identification. And I'm mostly going to grant them that. But that wasn't ever really the issue, right? Unless you were exclusively about how do I get tenure at a major American university or how do I publish papers in top journals, there was a bigger question of, I'm going to put funding for RCTs in, some stuff's going to happen, and then I'm not just going to get papers out, I'm going to get better development outcomes out. It's that black box that I want to sort of open and explore. And so I want to build a conceptual and kind of visual framework for the complete log frame. If you've ever worked in development, you know if you want to get money from people, you've got to master the jargon of the log frame, right? Which I had been in development a while before I took it, before I had to do it. And I want to lay out the complete log frame of what the RCT has to be, because we have to have a logical framework that connects inputs to activities, to outputs, to outcomes, just like we do for every other project, right? If RCTs are going to evaluate a health project or an education project, they need a log frame. And with that, I'm going to show that the first generation RCT claims were just completely false about the 5 key points, and that the second generation practice has mostly changed to reflect the fact that they learned that they were completely wrong, but they haven't really been super public about that. So it's one of these cases where the debate is over, they lost, but they continue to win by having conceded intellectually to keep the practice going. So I need some preliminaries to build up to this, and the first is that I want to talk about, I'm going to build sort of a framework that's going to help me then make these points in a vocabulary I hope we can use. The first is the design space. The design space just says everything I would need to put into a manual in order for the project to be implemented. For a project or program or policy to work, there have to be whole bunches of people do whole bunches of things, and I have to write I have to tell people what they should do, right? And, let's say I'm going to do a teacher training program. A teacher training program is just a description of a whole class of individual teacher training things I could do. I have to specify who's going to do the training, when they're going to do the training, what's going to be the content of the training, how am I going to follow up from the training. I got to specify everything about it, and I'm going to call the specification of everything about a specific project the design space. So we can think of the names we often use for types of projects are just names of the design space. Teacher training is just naming the design space of the space of all possible teacher training projects. And any given teacher training project in any given place is an instance of that class. So conditional cache transfer. And design spaces, by and large, are actually super high dimensional and often very complex. So a conditional cache transfer is actually one of the simpler possible development interventions. You're going to give some people some cache or in-kind benefit in response for compliance with certain conditions. But when we tried to sort of, what is the design space of a CCT? Even the design space of a CCT has at least 10 or 12 different decisions to make. Who's going to get it? When are they eligible? How often is it paid? What's the magnitude? Who is responsible for certifying that the conditions are met? And so, I forget how many, but and then when you look at different CCTs that have been evaluated, they're by no means the same across all these dimensions of the design space. So if I talk about a CCT, it's sort of like saying a car. Whereas any one of us, when we get in a car, we get in a specific car, right? So now, the second element is the response service. So I've just drawn an arbitrary three-dimensional space, and this doesn't show up very clearly, but this is just how good I did from implementing this particular element. I've got design element 1, design element 2. Any given combination of these two elements is a specific instance, is a project. I'm going to implement that project, and the response surface just tells me how well implementing that particular project did in terms of some outcome or output. So, and again, this is all, I think, pretty standard vocabulary, although we typically tend not to present it in any of its gory detail. So we have a response surface or fitness function or something over a design space. And the point is that since many elements of the design space aren't cardinal numbers and aren't intrinsically orderable, we cannot ex ante have any intuition about the shape of the design space. Because we can't assume it's smooth, we can't assume it's even continuous, because we don't know that these elements of the design space are sort of ordered in any direction, right? So whether some things are, like in a conditional cache transfer, I can imagine the magnitude of the transfer as this nice cardinal variable, but, whether the conditions are exclusively about health, whether exclusively about these three items of health, whether they're also about education, whether they're about this type of education, that type of education, those are all kind of elements of the design space that aren't intrinsically orderable, right? So we cannot ex ante assume anything about the response surface because we can't assume anything about the function. Okay. So now with that sort of simple frame, I can make clear two things I want to distinguish in the discussion, and these will come back later. The first is what I would call pure external validity. So I have two potential contexts, context A and context B, and then this is the response surface of the same project class over A and B. And the response surface is fairly smooth, so kind of everything I do works pretty well in context A, and nothing I do works at all in context B. And if I did exactly the same project in A and B, I would get different results, right? If I correctly estimated, and this is the estimate of what I would get if I correctly estimated program design 1, 3, meaning design element 1 takes the value 1, design element 2 takes the value 3. That's the correct point estimate of it. This is the correct point estimate of it. But they're just different in level. But I want to distinguish external validity from something that I might be using the wrong word for, but I like it anyway, which is construct validity. What I mean by construct validity is how rugged is the response surface over the program design space. Because any claim I would make about the class depends on how reliably an instance of the class identifies the class. So if two members of the same type of project have very, very different outcomes, then any generalization that CCTs do X or CCTs do Y that don't specify CCT of type 1, 3 or kind of don't have any validity to them. And that's what I call the construct, because oftentimes the constructs we use just aren't sufficiently precise to be of any worth. So if I say, if anyone tells you anything about RCTs have shown that teacher training X, ex ante that's bullshit. Because for sure, the response surface of teacher training in terms of its impact on teacher behavior, on student learning, is sensitive with respect to key design features of the teacher training, which means there is no construct called teacher training for which reliable generalizations can be made. Okay? So, and that's could be true in the same context. So it could be in the same context teacher training. If you just happen to do it with design element 3, it always fails no matter what else you do. But if you change the design a little bit, you have big success. So with rugged response surfaces over the design space, we have less and less construct validity. And that has nothing to do with external validity. This isn't two different contexts. This is two different designs in the same context. Okay, so that's the first set of preliminaries. And I would, I give sort of an analogy, which is, and I use this analogy in part because 1 year in college as a summer job, I poured concrete. So I have a strong affection for concrete because it induced me to become a professional economist. Because compared to pouring concrete all day, economics was a dream. And the thing about concrete is, in general, the wetter you pour the concrete, the weaker it is when it cures. But if you pour concrete dry, air bubbles form in the concrete, and that makes it weaker. So I don't know if you've ever watched people pouring concrete, but they often have this huge vibrating device that they're walking around sticking down into the concrete. That's to get rid of the air pockets to compactify it so that the chemical process, when it cures, makes for hard concrete. And if you don't compact dry concrete, it's actually very weak. So this is just an example where the response surface of hardness of concrete is actually super sensitive to the interaction between how wet it is, because if it's really wet, you don't have to compact it, but it doesn't dry very hard. But if it's really dry, you can make it really hard, but you have to optimally compactify it. So there's an interaction effect. So the response surface, even for something as simple as concrete, is actually rugged. And you can't make, all claims about this relationship. We're assuming optimal compaction for each level of water content, right? The other reason for using this is I just get a kick out of saying this is a concrete analogy. I'm my own best audience, so which is good because I'm here my whole life. So the preliminary number 2 is I want to talk about organizational capability for policy implementation. And in order to talk about that, I need a couple of concepts. The first concept is that policy is a mapping, and it's a mapping from states of the world to actions by agents. So if you think what a policy is, it says, here's the state of the world. then do this. So a fire insurance policy says, if the state of the world is your house burned down, we, the insurance company, as agents of this policy, owe you some money. So it's a mapping from states of the world to actions that are contingent, right? It's contingent on the states of the world. Now, an organization's capability to implement policy depends on the ability of the organization to induce its agents to correctly ascertain the state of the world. You know, if I have a health organization and I have some doctors and they have a policy of implementing certain diagnostic and therapeutic checklists, they have to have specialized training to be able to correctly ascertain the state of the world and then correctly act on that state of the world. And I've got to induce my agents to do that. And achieving success from the policy requires that I have the right types of capability. Right? So some things could be really super easy of capability, like because the state of the world needs to be assessed is really simple, the actions taken are really simple. And some things require a lot of capability because the state of the world's subtle, the state of the world could be debatable, it requires judgment, and it's very difficult for me as a supervisor to assess whether or not the correct state of the world, and this is why we have theorists that do principal agent stuff, because principal agency is the problem of how do I monitor my agents when the states of the world are complex and difficult to observe, and hence how do I create capability from constructing it. And even though we talk a lot about policy, my contention is going to be that a huge amount of the variation that we observe in outcomes around the world isn't driven by policy at all. It's driven by the capability to implement policy. You can have whatever policy you want, but if you can't implement it, it doesn't matter. And kind of the cleanest illustration I've ever seen of this is this group of people just mailed 10 misaddressed letters to addresses in hundreds, 150 or some countries around the world. And you think, why would they do that? Well, because it turns out every country in the world has exactly the same policy about misaddressed foreign mail. They're all signatories to the International Customs Postal Union, and part of being a signatory means you all adopt the policy that if I get misaddressed mail from you, I return it to you within 30 days, and you have the reciprocal policy. So here's a case where we know ex ante, every government in the world has exactly the same policy. So if they were all implementing the policy, we should see exactly the same outcomes. Instead, what do we see? Well, the outcomes vary by the maximum possible that outcomes could vary. Some countries, like the Czech Republic, 100% of the letters came back, right? And in lots of other countries, in 25 countries of the sample, none of the letters came back. And in the bottom half of the countries by education, only 1 in 5 of the letters came back. So exact same policy spans the range of policy outcomes, so you can't attribute any of the variation in policy outcomes to policy, right? To the de jure policy. So this is like, then if we think about, we have a classification scheme, and this comes out of a chapter in a book I recently published about building state capability, which is about how you build capability. There are various analytic questions about what you're trying to do that determine the kind of capability you need. So sometimes you just need logistical capability, by which we mean what you need to do. You need an organization that's transaction intensive. You have to have a lot of agents. But none of those agents have to use any local discretion. It's all a script. I can script exactly what every agent should do with respect to a small, easily understood, codifiable set of states of the world. And then if they do that, it works. So the Postal Service, the UPS, the FedEx, they all work exactly the same because they all have exactly logistical capabilities. They just need their agents to follow the script, and it works. Other things, like things we call implementation-intensive service delivery, are transaction-intensive. We need lots of agents to do it. They're locally discretionary. We actually need those agents to positively exercise their discretion based on a known technology to deliver a service. These levels of capability organizations are just night and day different. Just vastly higher levels of capability are required to do implementation-intensive stuff than to do logistical stuff. So, and at the top is sort of policy making. The making of policy requires discretion, and sometimes not is based on a known technology, but it's not transaction intensive. You can actually run a pretty good central bank with a half a dozen, and that might be an exaggeration, but half a dozen really capable people, and you can do many of the important policy functions of a central bank. But many of the functions of banking you can't do. You can't do payment systems. You can't do regulation. Right? Regulation's actually implementation intensive. So you might be able to run monetary policy really well, but not, in fact, be able to regulate banks because you different capability requirements. Okay. So the point of that is that now, and this is where I'm headed to a figure that I'm going to love and you're going to hate. It's going to be like seeing Jackson Pollock for the first time. You're going, oh, that's just a mess. My 2-year-old could do that. I'm building a figure. So over the same design space that I'm going to put a response surface of what would happen if I were to implement that particular project is the capability of the organization to implement that project. This just measure, can the organization you have do this? And since the design space may differ by the magnitude of capability required for implementation, there's going to be parts of the policy design space that I, as the government of Malawi, or I, as FedEx, or I, as an organization, can do, and there are going to be stuff that I just can't do, right? I just don't have the capability to implement it with fidelity. And I've just arbitrarily drawn some shapes to emphasize that this is arbitrary. It's just like I'm just using a computer to draw shit, right? This isn't like data. I wouldn't even have, if I were slightly more sophisticated, I would have drawn these as discontiguous bits. I'm not even clear that these implementation components are contiguous because I don't know the ordering of the space. But this one is a limited capability country. It can only do stuff in this range of the design space, whereas this is Denmark, or prototypical Denmark. They can kind of do anything they feel like, right? If you can design it, they can do it, right? So that's my second set of preliminaries. Now, the third set of preliminaries is exactly the same thing, but in a completely different space, which is, for a variety of reasons, right? Both benign and not benign, meaning political support, the response surface of efficacy and the response surface of political support aren't the same thing, right? Governments maybe have non-benign motives for stuff they're due. There's also a response surface over the design space that says, what's the extent to which I can generate and sustain the political coalition to authorize this policy? Can I politically do it? Right? And that response surface, again, just using a computer to draw things so that, that response surface over the same design space may look very different. Right? And this actually is discontiguous. It's like, this is really popular here, but here you have zero political support to do anything in there, but suddenly out there you can, if you design it this way, this makes it really popular. Right? So now, I'm building this because if I want to make the claim that I have discovered a policy that will lead to better human well-being, I have to say the policy meets all three criteria. It has to be within what I call, and I just made this word up too, what I call the Trinity. In a more religious place, people would laugh that I made up the word Trinity. Wow, this is a secular crowd here. So, the Trinity is, in order for me to take up, and I use policy, program, project kind of interchangeably. It could be a project that's really self-contained. It could be a program, which is a sequence of projects. It could be a policy. In order for the policy, program, project to actually be effective, it needs to be instrumentally correct. the response surface over the instance of the policy project program being implemented actually has to have a complete and correct causal chain that leads to the outcomes I claim. So I could have a project that just doesn't work because I'm causally wrong about what will change human behavior, right? But it also has to be administratively feasible. I have to be able to have an organization that's capable of implementing with reasonable fidelity and with the resources available the project. So if you tell me, if I had, 16 Einsteins and 3,000 Mother Teresas and $1 billion, I could solve poverty in Ethiopia, that would be of mild interest to me because I have none of those things, right? I have the average Ethiopian, right? I have no money to first order, and I have kind of no Einsteins. So the administrative feasibility is just, is the capability space consistent with that? And finally, policy is always political. I have to be able to create and maintain, political support for what I'm going to do over time. And if I can't do that, I can't do it as a policy of a government at least. And one can imagine other organizations maintaining that. But even in any space, you have to be able to act, at least maintain the political authorization to act. Some people trying to do, public-private, some people trying to do private schools just get thrown out of the country by the government because they can't even maintain the political support to be able to do what they want to do, even if they don't need government resources or agents. So the upshot is, we have to visualize something ugly like this, right? And I warned you it was going to be ugly. But we have three different surfaces there, right? We have the administrative capability surface that in this particular case, they can only do this very narrow range of things, right? Anything that's like over in this space, it might be a high point on... So this is the response surface. And again, it's this smooth hill. But any point on this response surface that isn't inside the capability space is irrelevant to us to first order because we can't do it. It doesn't matter if it would be really terrific if we did do it. We can't do it, right? Unless we can imagine a way of, in addition to doing the program, also changing the capability space, which we'll come back to, right? Then here, again, is drawn a political support space. This rugged Alpy-looking thing is the political support space. So projects over here are like super, super popular, but they don't actually work very well. The response surface is way alone, and we can't do them anyway, right? There are projects here that generate an enormous amount of political space, are feasible, and kind of are far and away not the best of the response surface, but it's on a positive part of the response surface. Okay? Okay. This, I think, diagram is... So in this kind of conceptual and visual frame, right? And you can think of it, and the better way to think of it, but PowerPoint just wouldn't do it, right? You could think of those things as stacked, right? I have a response surface, I have an administrative feasibility surface, I have a political supportability surface over the same, and of course I've reduced it to 2 dimensions to be able to draw it all each of which is a mapping from a super high dimensional, potentially complicated instance of a class of a type of project. Okay. With those preliminaries, now it's easy to say what I want to say. So, the first generation randomistas claim was significantly more funding of rigorous independent impact evaluation using the techniques of randomized control trials will lead not just to better academic papers, but actual significant improvement in the development process that will lead to higher human well-being. That was their claim. Well, another way of putting that claim would have to be that the kinds and types of knowledge that in principle and practice can be generated by applying RCTs via independent impact evaluations to development projects, programs, and policies are a key binding constraint on development practice. That is, if I know better where that response surface is, I will in fact do much better and can in fact do much better. So the binding constraint on me being able to do better things is knowing the shape of the response surfaces with greater confidence and accuracy, and hence greater investments in RCTs will lead pari passu, meaning other stuff will then have to happen, to significantly higher well-being cost effectively, meaning what I spend on RCTs will pay itself back because I will do stuff much better, and that will be a high return investment. Okay? Okay. So now that I can state what they're saying, and need to have said, right? If they didn't say this, it was just about writing papers, and hence was mildly interesting, even in this crowd of like this many people in all of Manhattan that even care about this. It would have only been interesting to a small subset of that crowd, right? Sort of every part of that is false, except the one that's true, right? So, the knowledge about the response surface over policies programs acquired through RCTs, we have to make a number of claims about it, right? One of those claims is it's superior to other evaluation methods. That's true. And again, and I'm glad Angus is here, for those of you who can't see. He's shaking his head, disagreeing with this. Okay? So, which makes me feel good. Because what I'm saying, and what I said I was going to say in an earlier version, but didn't want to speak for Angus. I was saying, I'll even concede you this even though Angus won't, right? I'll concede you this because this is a really deep and sophisticated thing, and I've read and understood some of the points that Professor Deaton makes, right? But for these purposes, I'll grant you that. Even if it were true that this was a vastly superior method for identifying the response surface, you still need to make 5 other claims, all of which are kind of obviously false. So debating the subtleties of this, we need to keep in mind that this is a log frame. It's a logical framework. We kind of have to have all of these things be true in order to get through the black blocks from better this to higher human well-being. And so first, it has to be the case that this method can be generated about highly consequential development actions. I would argue that's false. Most of what leads to higher human well-being is living in places with higher levels of national development, which means you have a more productive economy, you have a more capable state in general, you have a polity that's actually reasonably responsive to the needs and wishes of its citizens, doesn't torture them, doesn't throw them in jail, right? And those things are ontologically aggregated processes, and the individuated interventions are second order to that. Meaning, if you live in a better country, your well-being is going to be higher, and whatever I do, given the national development of the place you live in, the extent to which design features of individuated programs are better or worse is like completely trivial compared to the national development process. First claim. So, and if in fact economic development happens at the level of a social aggregate like an economy, then I can't randomize across an economy. An economy is necessarily an aggregated process, ontologically, not individuated, so I can't treatment and control it to individual people, which means this method doesn't work at all to discover things about those processes. Second, this knowledge generated by RCTs has to lead to feasible large-scale interventions. My argument, that is false. Mostly, the quality of interventions in the efficacy of development projects and programs is limited by the administrative capability of the organizations, not by their knowledge of the designs of the response surface. They know tons of stuff that they just can't do anyway. So knowing there are other points on the response surface that would also be better than the stuff they're already not doing actually doesn't change anything. Right? So I think mostly administrative feasibility is the key constraint. So kind of a more adequate knowledge of the response surface. Third, it either has to be in the region of already having political support or itself be importantly consequential for political support, and I think neither of those is true. Kind of having RCT evidence or not having RCT evidence has not been like hugely consequential to the evolution of policy in lots and lots of domains. So the United States has had, significantly scaled, large commitment to doing RCTs in social policy, at least since the 1970s. Nobody sort of looks to the United States as the super leader in social policy. So you would have a hard time claiming that this in and of itself is going to alter the shape of the political function, which means, again, discovering points on the response surface that would be super cool and groovy if we did them, but we can't do them because the politics don't line up, doesn't actually help anybody. Third, the knowledge generated, you see I have to repeat this sentence every time, the knowledge generated through the RCTs would have to be of sufficient construct validity to guide action. I would have to be able to tell you, not stuff like teacher training works, but I would have to be able to tell you stuff like, here are the 9 design elements of teacher training. Here is the particular configuration of those elements that works. And so investigating a response surface by drilling down a hole through the response surface, through to a design space here and there in a completely uncoordinated fashion, does not add up to the detailed granular knowledge we would actually need to have in order to guide implementation. So without construct validity, we're doing what we're doing is we're doing, systematic reviews of evidence that are just gibberish, because we don't have the underlying analytical vocabulary of the design space to say we're getting these different results because they're different points in the design space, and these configurations of the design space work and these other ones don't. Right? Most of these systematic reviews are just saying gibberish. What's the construct we would have to have in order to really understand why things work and don't work? Without that, kind of a list of what worked. So what's happening now is people are making lists of things that have worked and not worked. And, by the way, without even the information about what it was in sufficient detail you could judge it. So I did teacher training here and it didn't work. I did teacher training here and it did work. Said, well, I have a framework for teacher training. Here are the 42 design parameters. Where were you on each of those 42 design parameters? The papers don't even have the information so that an expert could judge what had been done, much less where it was. Okay? And then finally, it would have to be generated of sufficient external validity for this cost of generating the RCTs to kind of be amortized and made cost effective. I can do a super expensive study of the mass of an electron and have it be worthwhile. Why? Because the mass of the electron never changes. It's the same through all the universe, through all time. So the best study of the mass of an electron is the mass of an electron, and I amortize the cost of the study. Without external validity, I don't know whether or not my study was cost effective. Because unless I can tell you the range of contexts over which this result applies with something like well-validated what scientists call invariance laws, like this experiment is invariant with respect to the following things, like all physical laws are invariant with being in a non-accelerating reference frame. That's an invariance law. Without an invariance law that says here are the contexts to which my results can be applied, I just have no idea what to do with it, right? I didn't even finish that sentence, it looks like. And the response that, well, we don't really need that because if we got enough RCTs, would kind of learn that, is really facetious because one element of context is time. So you could say, well, I don't really need external validity. I'll just do it here. Yes, but is here now the same as here tomorrow? Well, if I don't have a set of invariance laws that tell me why here now is not like there now, then I don't know whether here now is like there now will be like here tomorrow. Right? I mean, just simple example, right? Suppose I do teacher training, but my teachers have no motivation in the existing context for performance. It could well be teacher training fails because the external context is motivation. It could be tomorrow I change the teacher motivation parameters such that now teachers in my place are motivated. My result for the same place. So context isn't place. Context is place and time, or more particularly, context is some list of parameters that affect the performance of the response surface. And without a complete delineation of those, we have no idea whether or not something has external validity. Because it could be that we did this study in this state of India in 2018, and in the next week they change some other important features that change the response surface with respect to the project we just did. So external validity is like this super demanding criteria. It's not place. It's place, space, everything. And without kind of science around this, more experiments don't help. Right? If the essence of science were experiment, there'd be a Nobel Prize for alchemy. There's not a Nobel Prize for alchemy because their theory was wrong. And doing and accumulating a large body of experiments without theory is alchemy. It doesn't actually lead to science, and hence you don't know this. So my argument is the first generation of stuff sort of ignored, won a debate on a very superficial level here, it ignored those 5 other things. Right? So if we look at the first generation, which was, we are going to do independent impact evaluations, which would mean researchers are going to drop in on other people who are implementers doing projects. We're going to do before and after evaluation of their projects. We're not going to be involved in design. We're not going to be involved in implementation. We're going to drop in as impact evaluators in the way that impact evaluation has been done. And through those independent impact evaluations, we'll learn more about the world. They've completely given up on that for a whole variety of reasons. And so now what they're doing sounds like they're still using randomization, but they're using it in a completely different log frame. So the sense in which the debate is over is none of the original users of randomization have stuck to their original set of claims because they have learned and acknowledged they were completely wrong. And so they've moved on to a new set of claims, right? But without ever being super clear as to what they learned, how they learned it, and why they shifted. Because it's never super beneficial to you to tell your funders you made a mistake, but keep giving us money. And I shouldn't even be that cynical. It's just, people change their mind because they learn stuff. So now they're much more engaged with the organizations they're working with, which means they're no longer independent. So the whole kind of first-generation rhetoric was these places like the World Bank, they're full of recalcitrant bureaucrats who don't really care about outcomes, so we need to go in and beat them up because we're the true standards of science and rigor. They've given up on that rhetoric completely. So now they say we work with partners, we join in on the design phase. Well, you can't say you're independent and call it a partnership. You can't say you're independent and be involved in the design phase. You can't say it's independent and you're the implementer. So a lot of things that are now being done with RCTs, the implementer of the intervention is the same people as the people doing the evaluation. That's not independent impact evaluation. That's something very different. When they do work with governments, they're working with governments on the generation and use of evidence on much broader issues than just doing ECTs. They've completely conceded that the RCT has some super special role in the politics of doing things. They've completely conceded on construct validity. They've acknowledged now that, the idea that you're going to stumble into the design space in exactly the highest point such that if it's not positive at this point, it's nowhere positive, they've completely given up on. So they now emphasize the sequential process of first piloting, then doing this, then doing that, and doing the impact evaluation at a late stage after you've been able to iterate across the design space to hopefully get to something, and completely conceded on external validity. By now, and by the way, I was the bank task manager of record for one of the very first RCTs, so in a weird way, I'm the father of a father of the RCT movement. And when I said to the, so I was, the bank task manager responsible for accounting to the bank of the money we were spending to do an RCT. And when I said, you guys know this isn't like going to produce externally valid knowledge, the answer was, well, there haven't been any RCTs done. We don't know, because we'll be the first. And since they're first, there'll be nothing to compare it to, and since there's nothing to compare it to, who's to say we're not the one and only right answer, right? That was a very clever trick 20 years ago. Now there's half a dozen RCTs on nearly anything, and all of them are contradictory. So now you have to concede external validity, because you could only even maintain illusions about external validity until you did it. Well, now they've done it, and they've done it enough that they can't maintain external validity. So we're doing now RCT 2.0 or 2.5 or maybe even 3.0, and that has started to address many of these concerns, but my concern is, I think, a better, clearer articulation of the complete log frame whereby we're going to have progress. It would be super helpful. Now, I'm at slide 24 of 86 prepared slides. So I have a 90-minute presentation on each of those 5 points. Meaning I could go 90 minutes on why this isn't important, 90 minutes on external validity, 90 minutes on construct validity, 90 minutes on administrative feasibility, but I'm not going to do that. I think now I'm going to stop and take questions, because I think lots of you here by now must have some response, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Because it's now, 5:21, and we have till 6. So, Yeah, I learned from some teaching training that I took that you should actually wait 2 minutes from the time you ask questions to when you call on people, because otherwise the person with their hand up first usually doesn't have the best question. But you had your hand up second, so I'll call on you. And you might as well say who you are, because it's all a small, intimate crowd here. More intimate than you probably want to be, but...
Tim Ogden from NYU DRI. Which of these are not arguments to cancel the 2020 census?
The what?
The 2020 census. So most of these things that you sort of laid out would say what we're going to gather in the census is related to the capability of the people running the census, which may not be the things that we actually care about. The things that we learn from the census may not be true the next day, because lots of things will change between when we look at the data and report it, and then anybody does anything with it. That we're not learning very much about it because we don't know what the design space was in the first place. All those sorts of.
So, first of all, there's a huge difference in the logistical capability between collecting facts and understanding causal connections. So a lot of what the census does is just collect facts, right? What? Maybe.
Which are not time invariant.
And again, nobody ever claims that the findings of a given survey aren't a snapshot of when the survey was taken, right? But second, partly where I would go with this, and partly, for instance, what I'm working on my own research, is how do we expand the capability of organizations, right? And there you would want evidence, and you want to lay our causal models out. And we have a whole set of procedures of how we would build the capability of organizations. And our view is you build the capability of the organization to crawl the design space by crawling the design space. Meaning we're going to build the capability of the organization to do stuff by doing stuff and building intrinsically into the process of the organization, learning by doing, right? And that's going to create a better, more likely way of coming to efficacy than if we imagine we can, separate out the design stage, the implementation stage, and the learning stage. So all of this applies to all organizations, but I'm talking about a very different way of making learning work than imagining the RCT provides us a magic feedback bullet that can be done independently of working with the organization. Yeah?
So, my name is Norman Green. So in 2016, the Congress passed legislation on foreign aid effectiveness, requiring greater amount of monitoring and evaluation for projects. So are they requiring something that is futile and a waste of time? Is the real question, we're dealing with imperfect knowledge continually. And what are we going to do lacking perfect knowledge?
Right.
Do nothing or do something?
Right.
As Angus Deaton says in The Greatest Escape, cut it out with RNA.
I won't. So there's kind of two things there, right? One is, if you want to spend taxpayers' money, you have to be accountable to the taxpayers. Like, no one who does or works around foreign assistance should expect people to give you money without your being forced to provide account for it. But the question is forcing a particular model of impact evaluation uniformly on everything that's funded by foreign aid the best way to get to effectiveness and accountability? And my argument is it's deeply not, in the following sense, right? One is that the main way I feel foreign assistance can be effective is by conveying around the world a sense of two countries and policymakers what are likely to be economic growth enhancing policies, and encouraging them through a variety of ways to adopt those. All of those are super low probability of success of activities, and all of them are super impossible to parse out causal attribution of. So let me give an example. I've worked in India off and on since 1991, and up until about 91, India had one of the most closed, had an economic regime that was both super dirhist, the government regulated everything, and it was super closed with respect to the outside world. Imports were just restricted at just unbelievably high barriers, right? The Ford Foundation paid some money to create a think tank in India to advocate for more open policies, more relaxed markets, more open trade regimes. And again, not neoliberal, just starting from a completely controlled environment to move to less controlled. Right? Okay. Suppose I spent, as the Ford Foundation, $10 million doing this for 5 years. And they wrote some papers, and they held some conferences, and some people got together. Then, in 91, for whatever reason, the Indian government undertook some serious reforms. I have done a completely non-India specific estimation of how much various countries have gained from their growth accelerations relative to their business as usual growth. And the consequence of what the Indians did in the 1990s is $3.5 trillion. It's like I spent $10 million a year, couldn't tell if I was really pissing it away or not. Like, how would I rigorously defend this $10 million a year? But then later, something really terrific happens, right? And has been far more consequential for the well-being of Indians than anything directly that the Ford Foundation could have done. So if I say I have to judge each individual expenditure of foreign aid item by item on a causally attributable basis, I am going to prevent myself from working on what's most important. And that might have been the purpose of what Congress was trying to do. Meaning, if I want to attack something that otherwise looks good, I don't directly attack it. I first say, oh, yeah, I would love to do this, but first show me rigorous evidence it works. Right? And as a foreign assistance kind of worker and development person, I say, fuck you, show me the aircraft carrier is cost effective before we quibble about whether we're going to spend another few pittance of $1 billion on foreign assistance. Because the real politics of it is the government, 99% of what the government spends isn't subject to any kind of impact evaluation because it has powerful political support. And by and large, my claim is RCTs are a weapon against the weak. The only people that get forced to do RCTs are people that are politically weak. If I'm politically strong and you come to me and say, I'm going to force you to do an RCT as an independent impact evaluation, you know what I say? I say, how many letters would you like from my constituents? Right? How many angry calls from my lobbyists would you like? Right? Talk about doing an impact evaluation of Medicare sometime. Medicare sometime. You won't get 30 seconds into the plan for that before AARP grinds that to a halt. So, again, everybody expects accountability, but to get accountability over complex things, we have to allow for professional autonomy and judgment embedded in a accountable for performance way. But the idea that strict RCTs as independent evaluations project by project to causally attribute actions could be the technique by which foreign aid is held responsible for outcomes is completely wrong, completely pernicious, is intended to destroy the industry, not support it. Well, glad to get that off my chest. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dana Birdie. I'm here at Steinhardt, and I've been doing RCTs in Afghanistan since 2005.
Great for you. Good.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really, really interested in your talk, and I wonder if people challenge you sometimes on throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And let me just give a few examples when I say that. One is that your first point, RCTs work and they do better at assessing impact than any other design, but who cares? Was the way I understood that. And I would argue that actually that does matter. And then another point you made seemed to suggest that first that these three principles are the most important things to have in place, these three conditions, in order to make sure that RCTs matter in the world. And that no RCTs can achieve these conditions. And that also, I think, is
that's
not necessarily the case, but maybe I was mischaracterizing your comments. I don't disagree with you that RCTs have sort of tyrannized a lot of people in the world. I think that's a really, really important point, and it gets lost. But I also think there's a backlash now against RCTs that will lose other points of value. I wonder what you think about
that. If I'm an economist, so if I want demand to go up, I want price to go down and the product to get better. So if you want more RCTs used in the world, you have to make them way more useful and way cheaper. Because so what I'm really attacking is the first generation RCT as independent impact evaluation, right? Which was the way in which it was explicitly structured. And that mode of doing it is way too expensive, way too unpopular, way out of touch with actually the findings being implemented and taken up. And so I'm all in favor of randomization. So sometimes, depending on the mood I'm in, right, I say I'm actually the biggest fan of the use of randomization. But what I know, if I want there to be radically more use of randomization to learn about the world used, I actually need to make it useful to the people I'm doing it with. So I've got to give up on independent. I've got to actually work with the people I'm working with in a way that they believe the results that emerge and will act on them. And that was explicitly the way the first generation were not done, including some of the impact evaluations in Afghanistan, which were done in a way that was constructed to not be useful and or helpful to the people implementing programs, and so they completely ignored them when they were done. So, not yours. I'm not pointing at yours, but I'm saying others. And so the first thing is, if we're going to keep the baby of using, differentiated, treatment and control to make sure that we really understand the response surface, and that's the baby, then we got to be clear what the bathwater is. Being independent is bathwater, right? It just was not the way in which you're going to do it, because if you're an independent impact evaluator, nobody wants you, right? Nobody wants you around. Second, you also have to bring, and I'm going to move to a slide. I'm going to jump forward through a bunch of slides, so close your eyes, because I don't want to show you all the wonderful slides you've missed. Any one of these slides would change your life if you knew it, but I'm skipping them all. But this slide is actually apropos of what you're saying, right? What I'm saying is, if you look at now what I've done is I've taken the design space and collapsed it from 2 dimensions to 1 dimension, right? And if you looked at the way large-scale development organizations like the World Bank worked, this is how they worked, is they would do a project design phase that was before implementation. They would sort through a variety of ex-ante evaluative techniques what was the optimal design. They would settle on a single design. Then they would begin implementation. The implementers were expected to be robots and follow exactly the implementation that the geniuses had decided on, follow through on it. And we had monitoring, which was mainly about input use, process compliance, maybe some things about outputs. And then after, we would do impact evaluation. Okay? And then we would learn, and sorry about this diagram, because I'm usually really not a big fan of arrows going backward in time. That's pretty dumb. So this arrow actually goes forward in time to the next project design phase, right? And that's how the World Bank was working. And to some extent, the big insight of the first generation of RCTs was, let's do this, that before and after is like a stupid impact evaluation criteria, so we need with and without. But everything else about the model stayed the same. That was just dumb. That was just like, the process of doing development was so deeply broken by then, and so deeply is acknowledged by broken by nearly everyone involved in it, that the idea that the fix to this whole way of imagining the world was to acknowledge that we needed to do with and without and not before and after, but everything else about the design phase, implementation phase, and learning phase being completely separated. So what I'm advocating for is something that looks more like this, which is, you're not independent, you're not exclusively worried about impact evaluation, you're working with your partner organization about efficacy of getting from inputs to activities to outputs to outcomes. So we're not just black box impact evaluation of inputs to outcomes. We're actually working with the partner organization on being efficacious even with respect to generation of outputs, right? And we're allowing for design, execution, monitoring, and impact evaluation to all kind of be tossed up. So we could use randomization across different treatment arms of the same program within regions over time to learn about what's efficacious internally for the organization as well as externally with respect to producing outcomes from outputs. So the key kind of causal chain that was being examined in an impact evaluation was from outputs to outcomes on the assumption that the problem with development projects where they were successfully producing outputs but were not embedded in a correct causal model of what would produce outcomes. And that was one of 18 possible failures of a development project. So in my long answer, I'm coming back to, I'm not against the R. I'm not against randomization. I'm against the RCT as envisioned as independent impact evaluation as being the key use of it. But if you want to do more randomization, you got to find more uses of it. They got to be more wanted, and they got to be a lot cheaper with a lot quicker feedback loops, because otherwise they're not very useful.
I think you've touched a bit upon that, but I was just thinking that, for example, all these like result-based finance mechanisms.
The what?
Like results-based finance instruments, like social impact bonds, for example.
Yeah.
Where you actually have to prove to like a paradigm around an investor that normally how you prove the outcomes are based on RCTs. So how would you recommend sort of like proving that to be able to, because the bonds are designed like that.
I like that. I don't care. Like, I think the social impact bond's pretty dumb. The whole thing could go away and not hurt anybody, so it's on the wrong track. So I'm not going to answer a question about how to make it better, because the whole thing could go away and everybody would be okay. Sorry. But
I want to ask you about the point that you conceded, which is that the RCT. So I think it might be, I mean, if you're even a little bit on the fence on that, it might be a bad idea to concede, because it's not, so right now too many people use RCTs because it's the best design. One part because it helps you get published, the other part because it makes you look scientific. Other independent agencies, NGOs, World Bank, every government bureaucrat who wants to protect his back are suddenly getting on the RCT bandwagon because it seems to be stamped with this best method. So I'm wondering if there is actually a big problem in conceding that point, and I'd like to propose to you and also maybe more Professor Peterson why we wouldn't concede that point.
I'm happy to cede. I mean, it's unfair to ask the guest to, like, but do you want to, like, give three or four?
Your other points imply that the last one's not true either. And that's because, I mean, project evaluation is the estimation of a parameter, right? So you have to specify in advance what parameter you want, right? And the parameter you get out of an RCT may or may not be that parameter you want. So there can be no general statement that this is always methodologically superior. I mean, sometimes it would be methodologically superior, sometimes it won't. And sometimes you could only do an RCT on a subsample of the population that's not the subsample you would do the population on. You know, so there's just 100 reasons. There's also the old theorem. I don't know, but I mean, there's the old theorem that Savage came up with in 1962, which showed that randomization is always wrong. It's always inefficient, and because no Bayesian would ever randomize, and that's simply because you know, kids use the word random. They say that's so random, and it makes no sense to it. And the problem is, if you want to know the truth of something, you've got lots of priors about the way the world works, and you want to design an experiment. An experiment does not necessarily involve randomization. And, you know, in physics and biology and so on, they never use randomization. What you want is the key experiment, the crucial experiment, which will reveal the truth about what you're doing, or reveal that parameter. So, you know, as Savage said, and Siva and Abhijit Banerjee and others have written about this recently, the only reason for randomization is if people don't agree about their priors. So, you know, if you have very different priors about what's going on, you can't really agree on how to do an experiment. But randomization is a very inferior substitute for that. But I mean, the key point, I think, more like this discussion we've been having, is just that, you know, you're trying to estimate a parameter, and you can never make a general methodological statement that says this way of doing things is always better, without saying what you're trying to estimate, why you're trying to estimate. You know, and for instance, some of those things where a donor gives you money and they want to know whether you spent the money usefully, that's very different use from trying to infer a causal chain which you could take somewhere else.
Which I think, you know, is precisely, like, if you want to use this, you should be more specific about what it is you're trying to do. So again, the use of RCTs as independent impact evaluation, where you have this project and we're going to do this project, and we're going to combine a whole variety of functions, like learning about the project, learning about its efficacy, providing for monitoring and accountability, and then also claim that we're going to derive some, effective parameter estimate from it, I think is loading too much on the same instrument. Whereas, again, a lot of this is saying we need to bring this thinking inside organizations who are trying to do stuff. And inside organizations, then you might be able to have a better specification of what is it that you want to know about achieving efficacy at what you're doing that you don't know. So let's design the experiment around what people inside the organization would be the key hypothesis, right? And use to some extent your control over the programmatic, variation to then align that around tests of hypotheses of interest to the organization, which again you can't do if you're independent. You can't do if you've already claimed its impact evaluation, because then impact evaluation necessarily ties it up with this monitoring and reporting function rather than a learning function. So again, it's not, I'm never attacking the R, right? Okay, I am attacking, no. But
People think the R gives you two balanced groups.
Right.
And that's just an error.
Right.
Because it doesn't. And the controls can be completely different from the treatments.
Right.
And they usually are.
Okay, another question?
Yeah, so I'm Stephanie Weichstra. Let's say that there's a program in education or criminal justice or some area, we're not really sure how well it works to do anything. You've made a lot of arguments that we shouldn't do an RCT and then generalize wildly and scale up on the basis of that RCT.
Absolutely.
And so that's what you've argued. But why would it be unhelpful or wrong to do an independent RCT? And then suppose we don't find an impact, and then to conclude, okay, well, this program isn't just this one program. We're not going to go on and then say, well, nothing like this could ever be effective anywhere. But that negative finding or null result, let's say it was a really well-done RCT, why wouldn't that be useful? And why wouldn't it furthermore be particularly useful to have that done by independent people who don't have, say, an incentive to just get along with those who are running the program and say that it looks good and so forth? So what's your argument against the negative use of RCTs, especially done by negative experts?
So there's two separate things, right? One is that the way in which the typical independent impact evaluation has been done is it presumes that you are at a fixed point in the design space, and the methodology encourages you to stay at that point in the design space for long enough for the RCT to power up, right? Now, let's say I've just introduced you to, you're trying to do something new. That's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. So this is just like a computer simulation, right? Where I pursue two different strategies of learning. I've got some unknown response surface. I have a design space. And I want to ask, what's the likelihood two different search methods will lead me to a high point on that response surface? Right? Now let's say I could, I could do things in which I change my design parameter once a month, just jumping around on the design space to see kind of how it seems to be working. I don't pay any attention to statistical significance. I don't pay any attention to power. At the end of the month, I just compare the two different arms I'm treating, jump to the one that's working best. And the other is I do an RCT, but to do the RCT, I do one treatment arm for a year. I evaluate the results statistically, move to another treatment arm, evaluate the results statistically. It's pretty easy to see. In a reasonably rugged fitness space, the first learning strategy is just going to way dominate the second learning strategy. You're going to get to a high point on the response surface. You're going to get to effectiveness much quicker if you move faster. So the more feedback loops you have, and the faster those go, the more likely you are to get to a good point on the response surface. A lot of the way in which independent impact evaluation is framed stops precisely that process. Because I went out to visit with my friend who's a head of a large and quite successful NGO that works on education in India, a project that her organization was doing in conjunction with JPAL, right? They were trying to do something. They had 2 treatment arms. They were like 2 months into doing it. It was obvious one of the treatment arms wasn't working, right? So I go out, I'm visiting, I'm seeing what they're doing. The JPAL junior person who's, helping with implementation shows up, and here's how she introduces him. She says, "Oh, Lant, this is Dan. His job is to make sure I don't help any children." And he was like, "Oh, my job is to preserve the integrity of the experiment." And he says, "Yeah, we agree. Your job is to make sure I don't stop doing this ineffective thing that we all acknowledge isn't working so that you can generate enough observations to write a paper for the QJE. And in the meantime, we've got to devote my NGO's resources to this obviously ineffective thing until you've got your paper." There is that tension, and to pretend there isn't that tension is just wrong, right? And it's just, so then the question is, what's the optimal sequencing of learning? And how would we learn? At what stage are we going to move very quick, be very flexible? At what stage do we think we're at a point on the response surface we can stop, lock in, devote significant amount of resources, and do an independent impact evaluation? So I'm not against doing independent impact evaluations. I just see independent impact evaluations as a tiny little component of a much broader learning and development strategy rather than being anything like a big deal. Yeah, Tim, back to you.
But that presumes that the information you're getting from the rapid feedback loops is accurate. And I think
again,
say the Raj study.
Not really. No.
Gates
I just no.
Okay. In both cases, you get these rapid feedback loops because we were canceled programs that later evaluation showed they actually work. It just takes 10 years.
Yeah.
So if your rapid feedback loops are showing you,
but again, it depends on the nature of the phenomena. It depends on the nature of what you're doing, right? But it's easy to construct. But by the same token, right? So I'm not saying these feedback loops are perfect, but short-term responses, for some characterizations of problems, short-term responses to immediate feedback loops are actually super more likely to lead you to a good place than waiting to have statistical significance, right? So again, but it all depends, which is partly the point, right? Because the point is, what the RCT movement unleashed on the world was a bunch of people drilling down on a bunch of really specific elements of the design space and kind of without huge amounts of thought about it, right? And that's just not a very effective learning strategy. And I realize that there's just no way you could actually infer that this table is showing you what I claimed it said, but that's the point of academic tables, I guess. Yeah?
I'm wondering if you would mind speaking a bit more on something that I thought I heard you say. By the way, Catherine,
Nice to see you.
it was about that it's in complete settings that most well-being occurs.
Yeah.
And so where does that put the idea of small interventions that might move some populations to a better place as opposed to a more macro approach?
Let me come back to that, because I think I want to come back and make sure, because this is probably the least popular thing in this audience I'm saying. So I want to make sure you really understand clearly how unpopular it is, right? Just so you don't later accuse me of being ingratiating. So fundamentally, there's two, when we say development, people really mean two completely different things, right? And they're ontologically different, right? One is national development. There's something called a nation state, maybe a society, and it has a dynamic. It has an economy, it has a polity, it has a society, it has some organizations that have capability. And those, what we mean by development is usually something that doesn't ontologically change. It just becomes more like itself, right? So this is always a frog, or its froggish, its ontological froggishness is invariant with respect to these different manifestations of its frogginess. But it doesn't become a stone, right? So national development is, in my mind, the transformation of and mostly a nation state, but you can think of regions, to a more productive economy, a more responsive polity, a more capable state, and more social equality. That's kind of what we used to call modernization until modernization, for reasons I kind of empathize with but also kind of don't understand, became verboten to say. And that's what we, like old fogies, mean by development. It's this national process of getting a more productive economy, more responsive polity, higher capability of the state, and more social equality. That's what we meant. It turns out, and then human development was ontologically about human beings. And I could then aggregate it, but the aggregation was incidental. So I could take the income of this room, and then I could take the income of the left-handed people in this room and of the right-handed people in this room. But left-handed and right-handed weren't intrinsic. They were like arbitrary aggregations. Intrinsically, we were still aggregating at the level of the what each person was a person. Right? Now, my argument is that the normative objective of most of us is human development. We care about something about human beings and their well-being, and we care about its distribution. But it turns out the instrumental means to human development is national development. So let me just give you one example. I'm going the wrong way. So these guys in Costa Rica at some think tank said GDP is terrible and we measure development wrong. We really should measure development exclusively in terms of, measures of how well off human beings are. They constructed a social progress index that most of us, if we looked at it, we would agree with what it went into it. They had 16 items, aggregated into 3 items, aggregated into a social progress index. And then if you take their social product index, which was constructed on the basis that GDP per capita and all this stuff were bad measures of development, and regress it on, is your economy a democracy? How capable is your state and your GDP per capita? The R squared of this relationship between social progress and national development is 0.9. The correlation, I thought I put that in there. Correlation of those two things is 0.96. We can't get 0.96 correlation out of stuff when we try and measure the same thing. If we measured child mortality 2 different ways across 100 countries, we wouldn't get a correlation of 0.96. So the point is, if you get national development, you kind of get everything. And my argument is that's really super intuitive, because the economy kind of determines what are the available resources to devote to problems and things human beings care about. A responsive polity means the government's reasonably responsive to what its citizens want. And administrative capability is kind of whether those organizations can accomplish those goals. You would expect that if I have a responsive polity and a capable administration that has at its disposal a large amount of resources, they'd solve every problem endogenously. And that the component of explanation of why some human beings were better off and some weren't, that some places had knowledge of the response surface and some didn't, would be completely endogenous to the capability of the organizations of the place they lived in. So the space for an exogenous component of knowledge of program design to be an important explanatory factor into why some human beings have high levels and some have low levels, I think just doesn't make any sense at all. So if I were working on development, I would work on one of the big 3 things. I'd work on economic growth, I would work on whether countries have responsible polities, or I would work on administrative capability, and I would see everything about program design as subsumed in those larger objectives. I'm going to get to more capable organizations by helping them build more effective programs, not I am going to prove human well-being mostly by bringing more effective programs into places with the same level of development. And I think I could beat your head. I could show you again and again and again this is true, but basically broad-based development solves every problem. One more question, and then we probably should quit.
Hey, Andrea from college. So my question is that so I guess my econ colleagues a little bit further down the program are
You're in a PhD?
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. Sorry. So my question is, I've been seeing this trend that lots of my econ colleagues are now doing RCTs, but because of many of the things you've been mentioning, been pairing it up with also trying to get a structural estimation model from them to kind of at least have a more something more generalized to say about the different types of inputs. How would you say that, how do you feel about this? Is it going in the right direction? How does it articulate with the points you've just made?
Yeah, I'm again, I'm a development, my official title is I'm a professor of practice. So I explicitly go between sometimes the world of practice, sometimes the world of academia. If I were in the world of academia, the first generation made itself famous by wandering around the world and putting a drill down and saying water is this many feet deep without a theory of hydrology. That's done. If you do that now, you can't. I hope the time in which you could get a PhD by dropping a well down and claiming, I know for sure water was this far deep without a theory of hydrology is over. So yeah, you've got to pair it with something like what Angus was saying, which is what have we purposefully learned about the world and theory from the experiment we've done? Because I've seen a whole bunch of people stand up and propose that their value added is that they've done an RCT that proves demand slopes down. And it's people, we knew that. And you might have been poisoned with this rhetoric that all evidence that existed before that wasn't RCT is completely invalid, but that's just a stupid way to be a Bayesian about the world. So you can't do an RCT that says demand slopes down and expect economists to nod and say, well, that's a contribution to the world. So you got to think, how are we, advancing the discipline in what we know by perhaps using randomized techniques to test purposefully specific hypotheses so that we've designed, in some sense, the experiment. And again, but you have to admit that this leads you away from necessarily being useful, right? Because if you think about it, and this is the last, just to be irritating one time before we quit. Everybody remember Dana Carvey and the church lady? And isn't that special? You got to admit it was always kind of this improbable case that I can make myself a famous tenured professor by doing exactly what happens to be the thing the world really needs really badly. That the world just happened to turn out that way? Isn't that special? That was always a pretty improbable combination of events, and I think we've learned it wasn't really true, and it's certainly not true for your generation anymore. So now what I'm saying is if you really want to write a PhD in economics, write a PhD in economics that contributes to the discipline of economics and our body of knowledge by combining structural and experimental things to test out hypotheses so that people like me that have been doing economics for 35 years actually learn something besides demand slopes down, and you've proven it with a randomized experiment about chlorine tablets in some country. But you've got to acknowledge that that's going to be of enormously less interest to a development agency who isn't in the business of advancing the field of economics. They're in the field of, hopefully, advancing human well-being. I like to end on time, and it is 6:02. So thank you very much.